Good evening, friends. Tonight we'll drift into the cobbled alleys of an empire where the mornings once echoed not with roosters, but with flutes, drums, and deep, brassy horns. Settle under your blanket, let your room dim gently, and allow your breathing to soften. If this calm journey helps you unwind, tap like and subscribe, only if it feels right. This is a story meant to cradle you into sleep, so close your eyes. And let's begin. Story 1. The Breakfast Drummers of Topkapi Palace. The mornings at Topkapi Palace weren't always grand ceremonies or whispered secrets behind silk curtains. Sometimes they began with something far simpler. Footsteps. Quiet, measured steps that made no attempt to be heard. These were the steps of the Mater drummers, whose daily ritual was perhaps the most peculiar form of alarm clock history has ever known. You might expect a royal court to rise with grace or subtle elegance, but here the sun often arrived to a slow-building boom, soft at first like a yawn of thunder, and then louder, deeper, until it filled the stone courtyard like a fog of sound. This was not music meant for sleeping. It was music meant for moving, and yet, in a strange way, it soothed the city. It signaled a return to order. The men behind the drums, those breakfast drummers of Topkapi, weren't noble nor poets. Most had once been orphans or Christian boys taken through the Devshirme system, trained into service for the empire. By the time they were placed in the Meterhane, the palace's musical corps, they had been shaped not just into musicians, but into a living instrument of state discipline. There was a precise method to their madness. Before dawn, a young attendant would light the coals under a copper tea urn, ensuring that by the time the drummers emerged into the open air, steam was already rising into the night sky. The instruments, kept wrapped in soft wool, were slowly warmed by the fire. Cold brass, after all, is hard on the fingers, and no musician plays well with frozen hands. Each drummer had their assigned place. Not just by rank, but by timbre. The lowest drums marched front and center, with the snare-like nakare and the powerful kettle drums in rows behind. It's said that if you stood exactly between the two front drummers when they began their synchronized cadence, the vibrations could loosen the very dust from the palace bricks. But why drums at all? Why not flutes or bells? Because drums didn't just call people to attention. They reminded them of who they were. The empire was large, too large for one man, even a sultan, to hold in his mind at once. But the sound of Mehter drums, that was the same in Cairo as it was in Sarajevo, in Aleppo as in Belgrade. When they beat, they made the borders feel close, tangible, audible. The breakfast routine began not with the sultan but with the kitchens. Enormous cauldrons, some the size of bathtubs, had to be heated in the dark. Lentil stew, called mercimek, çorbası, was often first, easy to prepare and hearty enough to silence a soldier's stomach. As the steam rose, so too did the drumbeat. It was as if the music stirred the ingredients from their slumber. For the cooks and the scullions, this rhythm was a marker. At the third round of drumming, it was time to add the salt. At the fifth, they began setting the trays. These weren't culinary cues by accident. They were training, passed down by generations of palace workers who knew that timing was as much about the ears as the eyes. There's a forgotten corridor in Topkapi, long since turned into a museum wing, where drummers once practiced their morning rhythm. The walls are thick, designed to muffle the sound from the rest of the court, but if you stand there long enough, some say you can still feel the faintest tap, like a heartbeat caught in the stone. Perhaps most curious of all was how quickly this became normal. Imagine trying to explain this ritual to a Venetian visitor, freshly off a merchant ship. Yes, we begin each morning by waking the kitchens with a military drum ensemble. Then we serve yogurt and hard-boiled eggs. It seems absurd, And yet, it worked. For centuries. What's more curious, though, is how the drummers themselves experienced it. Interviews from the 19th century, long after the meter had begun to fade, describe older musicians still tapping their fingers in sleep, instinctively echoing patterns from decades earlier. One man, whose name is lost, was said to have continued, drumming on his pillow every morning until the day he died. His wife said it made waking up feel like royalty, even if they slept on a straw mat in a village far from Istanbul. But was this truly a musical ritual? Or something deeper? When an empire uses rhythm to structure its mornings, what happens when the music stops? The Meta Band was not merely a performance troupe, it was a symbol of presence. You could close your eyes anywhere in the Ottoman lands, hear the roll of those ceremonial drums, and know without question that you were within the grasp of something vast, something deeply organized, deeply rooted. The sound was geography. It told time. It even delivered emotion. You see, the rhythms used by the Meta weren't improvised. Each march or Meta Marsha had its own structure built on centuries of codified sound. Some rhythms were slow and heavy, like footsteps across damp stone. Others were quick, bright bursts that seemed to chase the sun across the Bosphorus. The melodies that accompanied them were played on zurnas, a piercing double reed instrument, whose cry could slice through fog like a gull's call on the Marmara. But for the drummers, especially those tasked with waking the palace each day, it wasn't just about music, it was ritual. You've likely heard the phrase, rhythm of life. For the Meta, that phrase was literal. Every day followed a careful choreography. Rise before the kitchen fires, stretch while the tea steeped, gather under the covered portico, check your drum's tightness, and wait for the signal. The signal wasn't grand. It was a flick of the hand from the Kapı Arsu, the chief of the inner palace. But that simple gesture set the entire palace in motion. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to play the same pattern, at the same time, in the same place, for 10 straight years? One former janissary described it in his later writings. It was like walking the same trail through the woods so many times. The earth began to remember your steps. You weren't just playing music, you were pressing a groove into time. This was more than aesthetics. The Meta had political purpose. At major ceremonies, accessions, parades, military deployments, the band would stand at the front. Not as a guard, but as a declaration. The Sultan is here, the state is alive, the drums beat, therefore we exist. It is hard to overstate how deeply this penetrated the Ottoman identity. Children in Anatolian villages, far removed from court life, would mimic the Meta in their games, banging pots and using reeds as flutes. Caravan leaders scheduled departure times around the rhythms of local bands. Even rival armies learned to measure Ottoman presence by the drumbeat on the horizon. One Austrian officer once wrote, "You hear them before you see them, and by the time you see them, it's too late to run." But for all its grandeur, the palace Meta's dawn ritual remained oddly humble. The band never performed for applause. There was no audience but the cooks, the servants, and the wind that carried. The sound through the spires. Perhaps that's what made it so grounding. It wasn't performance, it was declaration. Each beat marked a moment in the empire's bloodstream. The first pulse before breakfast. The echo through empty hallways. The signal to the men in the kitchens to begin. The sound that drew the eunuchs from sleep, that stirred the ink-stained scribes from their mats. That told the gatekeepers to stretch their legs and prepare for the day's formalities. Even the animals seemed to recognize it. Dogs on the palace grounds would lift their heads, tails still, ears twitching to the rhythm. Birds in the plane trees overhead would go briefly quiet, perhaps in confusion, perhaps in respect. And yet, despite all of this precision, the Meta's drummers were not mechanical. They had lives beyond the courtyard. Some were poets, others practiced calligraphy in their spare hours. One was known to be an excellent baker, famous for his sesame cakes. After their morning duties, they often returned to quiet rooms, where they tuned, polished, and repaired their instruments, or simply sat in silence, sipping thick coffee. For outsiders, this routine seemed strange. Why wake the palace with military rhythm? Why use drummers to usher in lentils and goat's milk? But this was the Ottoman way. The state was not separate from daily life. Music was administration. Ritual was governance. The morning drums weren't an exception. They were the foundation. And yet, as centuries passed, the empire shifted. The role of the Janissaries became entangled with politics, corruption, and court intrigue. What was once a feared and disciplined class slowly turned unruly, more interested in influence than order. The Meta Band, still part of the Janissary institution, found itself swept up in that change. Whispers began to rise in the palace, that the drums no longer beat as crisply, that the rhythms were sloppy, that younger drummers were more interested in being seen than in playing well. It's hard to say if these complaints were fair, but they reflected a deeper fear, that the empire's pulse, the very rhythm of its mornings, was faltering. Still, the Meta continued, day after day, beat after beat, until one morning the courtyard was silent. No flick of the hand, no kettle, drum, no zurna cry, only the wind, only the memory of sound. What could silence an empire's heartbeat? It happened slowly at first, like a lantern dimming over weeks instead of hours. The Meta Band, once the centerpiece of Ottoman identity, began to vanish, not in a sudden blaze, but in a hush. There was no decree that said, "Stop the music." But one by one the rituals faded. The palace staff noticed before the statesman. A younger scullion once complained in his journal that he'd oversalted the lentil soup because the drummers hadn't sounded their usual fifth cadence. The cooks laughed. But the mistake was not his. It was the silence's. In a palace ruled by rhythm, silence was disorder. The Meta's decline reflected the transformation of the Janissary corps itself. Once elite warriors and disciplined servants of the state, the Janissaries had become entangled in politics, economics, and resistance to reform. They were powerful, but their power no longer flowed from discipline. It came from fear. Sultan Mahmud II saw this clearly. By the early 19th century, the Yirwai's empire had grown stagnant. European powers were reorganizing, modernizing, centralizing. The Ottomans, meanwhile, clung to centuries-old systems. Some, like the Meta, were traditions too sacred to touch. Others, like the Janissary corps, had become too dangerous to leave alone. The decision to abolish the Janissaries in 1826, an event now known as the Auspicious Incident, was not made lightly. But it was made firmly. Cannons were rolled into place around Janissary barracks. Fire was used, blood was spilled, and when the smoke cleared, thousands were dead, and an entire military class was wiped from the empire in a single week. And with the Janissaries, the Meta was disbanded too. The palace's heartbeat went quiet. The change was practical, but it left a cultural vacuum. There were no more sunrise marches, no more drummers to wake the cooks. For the first time in centuries, Topkapi Palace had to rely on something else. On clocks, on bells, on servants tapping on doorways with quiet knuckles. One court official noted that the kitchens now burned food more frequently. The timing was off. The rhythm was missing. The empire had embraced European military styles, new uniforms, new tactics, and Western-style marching bands with string instruments and harmonized chords. But it wasn't the same. You couldn't boil lentils by violin. You couldn't summon breakfast with a clarinet. Still, traces of the Meta lingered. In distant villages, musicians continued to practice old marches in secret. Some adapted the rhythms into folk dances. One former drummer moved to a small town near Konya. and taught the local boys how to keep time by listening to their own footsteps. "When the dust lifts," he said, "you're in the right tempo." And there were memories. Visitors to Istanbul, decades later, still recalled the way the drums had once echoed across the Bosphorus at sunrise, bouncing from minaret to minaret like a whispered prayer. A German traveller described waking before dawn and hearing a faint, phantom rhythm that he swore couldn't have been real. It was like the city remembered its own heartbeat, he wrote, even in sleep. By the late 20th century, the Meter Band saw a modest revival, not as a military force but as a cultural treasure. Today they perform at festivals, museums and commemorations. They wear the same traditional robes, the same towering headdresses. They play the same kettle drums and zurnas, but it's not quite the same, because the Meter today plays for people. The original Meter played through them. There's a quiet lesson there, one that echoes in more than just history books. Empires don't just fall with armies or treaties. Sometimes they fade with the loss of rhythm, with the end of routines that once felt eternal. The Meter Band wasn't just music. It was the sound of order, of waking up, of beginning the day not just as a person, but as part of a system, something bigger, something shared. You might not think of lentils and kettle drums as symbols of civilization, but perhaps they were. Perhaps they still are. And as you imagine those early mornings at Topkapi, the slow build of the drumbeat, the hiss of boiling water, the shuffle of feet across polished stone, ask yourself, what sounds begin your day? What music wakes your world? Story 2. Wool, Water and War. How Ottoman Uniforms Were Made. If you were a soldier in the Ottoman army around the year 1680, before you ever lifted a musket, marched into battle, or stood before the Sultan, you wore wool. Thick, dyed, hand-woven, creased wool. Whether you were stationed in the cold hills of the Balkans or the humid coastal stretches near Izmir, your first daily burden wasn't the weight of battle. It was fabric. And not just any fabric. The uniform of an Ottoman infantryman, or even a palace guard, carried with it the collective labor of hundreds. It was dyed in copper pots, washed in slow-moving rivers, softened with fuller's earth and olive oil soap, combed and carded by hand. No buttons were made by machines, no threads were stitched by idle needles. It all began with a sheep. Often many sheep, actually. You see, the Ottomans didn't just source wool the way we talk about materials today. They raised it, tracked it, taxed it. Sheep were counted in census records. Wool was bundled into ledgers. There were even inspectors whose job was to visit flocks in Anatolia and inspect the texture, softness and curl of wool fibers to determine their suitability for imperial use. Imagine that, your job being to pinch and rub sheep hair for the sake of the empire. Wool production in the Ottoman Empire was a massive rural economy in itself. Flocks were primarily raised in the high plains of central Anatolia, where the climate was best suited for hardy Karaman sheep. The wool from these sheep was durable, tightly curled, and naturally resistant to light rain, a helpful trait when you're marching through muddy fields in March. Once sheared, the raw wool was stuffed into giant sacks and sent, usually by oxen cart or for long distances boat, to the kiti workshops in larger towns. Kesi is the Turkish word for felt, but it also referred to a class of craftsmen skilled in the alchemical process of turning raw fleece into something wearable. The first step, washing. The wool was dunked in large vats of warm water mixed with soap made from olive pits, ash, and sometimes a pungent compound made from fermented urine. Yes, urine. Before you turn your nose up, keep in mind that ammonia breaks down oils in the fleece, making it easier to work with. A properly managed wool workshop often had a sour, musky smell that told you they were doing things right. Then came the carding, a back-breaking process where workers used large wooden brushes embedded with metal teeth to comb the wool into smooth, aligned strands. Sometimes this was done outdoors under the sun, especially in summer, to help dry the fibers as they were worked. The sounds of this process must have been hypnotic. Brush, comb, flip, shake, again and again, until each bundle of wool was smooth and ready for dyeing. Ah, the dyes! Perhaps the most secretive and carefully guarded process of all, Ottoman uniforms were rarely grey or bland. They were crimson, dark blue, deep green, or even saffron-hued, and achieving those rich tones was a science. Crimson came from the cochineal beetle or the root of the madder plant, both expensive and carefully rationed. Blue came from indigo, often imported, while greens were mixed by overdying blue-dyed wool with yellow pigments derived from wild herbs. The dyeing vats were enormous copper or iron pots suspended over wood fires. Wool was stirred slowly, almost meditatively, for hours, sometimes an entire day, by men with stained hands and soot on their faces. They wore aprons stiff with years of dried dye, and they knew, by feel, whether the color was taking. Sometimes the wool had to be dyed twice, sometimes more. Now one might think, after all this, that the wool would simply be dried and cut into fabric. But no. Next came felting. The Ottomans prized a particular type of fabric that blended the warmth of wool with the water resistance of felt. This meant soaking, pressing, rolling, and pounding the dyed wool under pressure, either by foot or with large wooden hammers operated by hand. It was noisy, physical, and exhausting. The workers in these stages were often young men from nearby villages, working barefoot in narrow wooden channels, stomping rhythmically to bind the fibers into dense cloth. If you closed your eyes near one of these workshops, you'd hear the thudding of soles, the squeak of pulleys, and the occasional clatter of wooden beams being adjusted, and then finally tailoring. This is where the process returned to silence and precision. Skilled seamsters, often trained in the guilds of Istanbul or Edirne, would cut the felted wool into tunics, vests, trousers, and caps. Each piece followed strict regulation dimensions, but allowances were made for body type, rank, and region. Her Janissary's coat was not sewn the same way as a cavalryman's. The tailors didn't just sew, they embroidered. Uniforms for officers included simple silver threadwork along the cuffs and collars. Buttons were made from horn or bone, hand-carved and polished smooth. The results weren't flashy by modern standards, but in their context, these uniforms were masterpieces of economy and durability. Soldiers could wear the same set for years, patching holes with leftover felt, tightening seams with waxed thread. Some even passed down their uniforms from father to son, especially in provincial garrisons. And all this, the wool, the dye, the pounding, the sewing, was done without a single modern machine. Just hands, heat, rhythm, and patience. Of course, for the soldier on the battlefield, none of this lightly crossed his mind. He would wake, dress, and cinch his coat at the waist, perhaps muttering about the stiffness or scratch of the fabric. But behind every thread was 100 unseen hands. Still, one has to wonder, how did a system so reliant on slowness, on handwork, on local labor, adapt to the coming tide of industrialization? By the early 19th century, things were changing. Not all at once and not everywhere, but the changes were unmistakable, even in places where time moved slowly. Steamships replaced sailboats, guns fired faster, and cloth, once combed, carded, and stitched by hand, began to flow from machines. The Ottoman Empire, vast and ancient, could not hold back the tide forever. It began at the edges, as it so often does. In the port cities first, Izmir, Thessaloniki, Beirut, textile merchants started importing machine-woven wool from France and England. Not all of it was better quality. In fact, much of it wasn't. But it was cheap, fast, predictable. A bolt of British cloth that might take 12 weeks to make by hand in Anatolia could now arrive in 12 days by ship from Manchester. Still, old habits held strong in the heart of the empire. In Istanbul's imperial tailoring workshops known as terzihane, the guilds resisted the transition to industrial fabric. For decades, they continued to dye, cut, and sew wool by hand. They saw themselves as protectors of tradition, not just of a craft, but of a world view in which clothing was not a product, but a process. But friction was inevitable. In 1826, after the abolition of the Janissary Corps, a great uniform crisis emerged. The Sultan's new army, called the Asakiri Mansur-i Muhammadiyah, needed entirely new attire. The old Janissary coats, with their sashes and voluminous sleeves, were symbols of rebellion. They had to go. Fast. Mahmud II envisioned a modern army, dressed more like the soldiers of France or Prussia, tunics, trousers, buttons, belts, and epaulettes. The trouble was, local workshops weren't equipped to mass-produce these new uniforms quickly enough. The sewing guilds could cut, yes, they could stitch. But their pace was centuries old, so the empire turned, reluctantly, to factories. The first military textile factory in the Ottoman world was established in 1835, just outside Istanbul, along the Golden Horn. It was called Feshane, named after its most famous product, the fez, or fez, those red felt hats worn across the empire. But the factory didn't just make hats, it produced wool cloth, dyed fabrics, and eventually full military uniforms. Inside, steam engines powered rows of mechanical looms imported from Europe. Workers, many of them young boys and war orphans, fed wool into one end of the system and watched fabric roll out the other. It was efficient, loud, smelly, and for the old tailors of the terzihane, deeply unsettling. What had once been a communal, spiritual craft, carding wool under the sun, dyeing it by feel, was now mechanical. Uniforms arrived in bundles, counted by weight rather than care. Each coat was near identical, but missing the little quirks that once marked human handiwork. A crooked seam, a patch of uneven dye, a button sewn just a little off-center. And the buttons, oh, the buttons! They became a symbol of the new era. Ottoman tailors had once fashioned buttons from horn or bone, carving each one by hand. But now machines punched them from brass and painted them in enamel. They bore imperial insignia, crescent moons, Taghra emblems, and stars, etched by acid and stamped en masse. Soldiers began to joke that they wore more metal than meat, but efficiency came at a cost. The new uniforms, while cleaner in appearance, were often less durable than their hand-felted predecessors. Rain seeped through machine-woven wool more easily. The bright dyes, especially the red and indigo, faded quickly in the harsh sun of the Syrian deserts and the Balkans alike. Still, the logic of the factory won out. Over the next few decades, military workshops across the empire began to adopt industrial processes. Small dye houses were replaced by central chemical labs. Tailors became assemblers, and entire regiments began to look nearly identical, line after line of grey-blue or khaki-clad soldiers marching in sync. The fez, too, changed. Once made by carefully felting layers of red wool by hand, it was now pressed into shape using steam molds and shaped in minutes. The old guilds balked, but the empire was evolving, or unraveling. It was hard to say. And yet, not everyone gave. In remote garrisons in the mountains of eastern Anatolia, the hills of Albania, the edges of Kurdistan, old habits lingered. Uniforms were still patched by hand. Local weavers still dyed fabric using beetroot and madder. In one tiny outpost near Erzurum, a captain reportedly had his uniforms made entirely by local women who'd inherited tailoring skills passed down for generations. He claimed it helped morale. Maybe it did. After all, a soldier is not just a pawn on a board. He's a man who sweats, freezes, and bleeds in whatever cloth you give him. And for the empire, the challenge was never just one of supply but of identity. What did it mean for an Ottoman soldier to wear a uniform that had been made not by his neighbor, his guild, his village, but by steam and factory and faceless production? Could a machine-woven coat still carry the honor of a hand-sewn tunic? Or had the empire, in gaining speed, lost something softer, something felt by the time of the Crimean War in the 1850s? Most Ottoman soldiers wore standardized uniforms that wouldn't have looked out of place on a French or British battlefield. There was pride in this modernity, but also perhaps a faint nostalgia for the warmth of hand-felted wool, for buttons that bore the memory of hands, and for clothes that once carried the rhythm of the land. As Europe marched into the modern age, the Ottoman Empire followed, but always a step behind. Not out of ignorance, but out of caution, resistance, and perhaps care. So the question lingers, in a world increasingly obsessed with speed, can slowness still clothe a soldier? Or must tradition always yield to the ticking of machines? Let me take you now to the early 20th century, just before the First World War, when the Ottoman Empire stood like a tired tailor at dusk, holding a needle that once stitched continents together. The empire's borders had shrunk, its armies were battered, yet they still marched, still stood for roll call, still dressed for war, and their uniforms, worn, dusty, fraying, still mattered. By this point, the vast textile networks that once stretched from Anatolian villages to Bosnian dyers had fractured. Much of the wool now came not from Ottoman flocks, but from imports, cheaper, faster, more uniform, and the dyes, aniline-based, chemical, efficient. They colored the cloth in sterile vats, not cauldrons over fire, but beneath the surface of this, mass production was a quiet, persistent echo of what had come before. Small workshops, especially in places like Kayseri, Konya, and Skopje, still produced boots and belts by hand. Local tailors patched soldiers' trousers with scrap felt, the way their grandfathers had. And in the military hospitals behind the front lines, elderly guild-trained craftsmen still mended torn coats by oil lamp. These were not nostalgic holdouts. They were practical people, keeping soldiers clothed when supply lines failed and factories fell silent under bombardment. One such place was the Istanbul Military Tailoring Depot, a sprawling compound where dozens of women, mostly war widows, and daughters of soldiers, worked at rows of pedal-powered sewing machines. It smelled of wool and coal smoke and barley soup. Outside, cannon fire could sometimes be heard from the Bosphorus. Inside, though, the rhythm was soft. Snip, foot press, stitch, pull. The old ways held on, quietly, through those who had never known another life. The tailors of the depot told stories while they worked, of sons sent to the Dardanelles, of brothers who never returned from Tripoli, but also of better days, when wool was dyed with beetroot, and soldiers wore cloaks heavy enough to block winter wind. One woman, Isel, was famous for her button work. She could resew 20 buttons in an hour, each loop perfect, each thread hidden. She once told a Red Crescent nurse that every button she stitched was like a prayer for the man who would wear it, that if it held through a storm, maybe he'd live. It's easy to forget that military history isn't only about generals and battles. Sometimes it's about the seam on a collar, the way wool shrinks in damp, the quiet horror of realizing a winter uniform isn't warm enough. In the trenches of Gallipoli and the deserts of Mesopotamia, Ottoman soldiers learned this intimately. Some cut slits in their coats to hide letters from home. Others traded their uniforms for civilian clothes after a retreat, hoping not to be recognized. Many in the last days of the war wore patched, threadbare coats that had long since lost their imperial markings. There's a famous photo, perhaps you've seen it, of an Ottoman infantryman in Syria sitting on a crate. His uniform is bleached, by sun and stiff with dust, but he still wears a fez, and it's tilted slightly to the side as if in quiet defiance. What fabric stitched that moment together? It's hard to say. It could have come from Fay Shane, or from a village dyer outside Bursa, or from a widow sewing by candlelight in a rear depot. In the end, the threads all blended. Wool from tradition, dye from modernity, stitches from memory. When the empire finally fell in 1922, so did the guilds. The military tailoring offices were shut. Factories were repurposed or abandoned. The fez was banned. New uniforms were designed for a new republic, sleek, neutral, Western, but not all was forgotten. In the back rooms of Istanbul's textile shops, you can still find scraps of that older cloth, thick, coarse wool dyed madder red, faintly smelling of age. Some are turned into rugs now, others into winter coats. A few are kept as heirlooms. Handful of elderly tailors, men and women now in their final years, can still tell you how to card Karaman wool or how to stir indigo dye until it deepens from sky blue to midnight. They speak slowly, sometimes forgetting a step or two, but their hands remember. If you give them a piece of felt, they'll run their fingers over it and nod. Too thin, not combed enough. Good for a vest, maybe. Not for boots. So we come to the end of the thread, not with a snap, but with a quiet fray. The story of Ottoman uniforms isn't about glamour or glory. It's about thousands of nameless hands, peasants, guildsmen, apprentices, widows, who, they're bent over fabric so others could march. It's about wool soaked in river water and dreams stitched into seams. And it's about how even in the heart of war, someone always has to sew the buttons back on. Story 3. Coffee, Diplomacy and the Quiet. Power of the Ottoman cafe. Imagine the scent first, earthy, dark, a touch of spice, rising in slow curls from a small copper pot. The sound follows, soft bubbling, faint clinking of porcelain, the scrape of a wooden stool across stone. Welcome to the Ottoman cafe. It is the mid-17th century in Istanbul, sometime around late afternoon. The city hums at a slower tempo now, the merchants having closed their stalls, the fishermen pulled in their nets. In one corner of the capital, tucked beneath the wide shadow of the imperial offices known as the Sublime Porte, a quiet ritual unfolds. Two men sit across from one another, one a clerk from the chancery, the other a local spice seller. Their robes are plain, but their discussion is rich, with politics, trade, stories from Edirne, rumors from Cairo. Between them sits a brass tray, on it 2 tiny cups and a pot of Turkish coffee, thick with grounds, black as ink. There is no music, no rush, only conversation. This is not a cafe in the modern sense. There are no menus, no espresso machines, no noise. In Ottoman Istanbul, a kahvehan, a coffee house, is part tavern, part town square, part lecture hall. It is where news is shared and opinions sharpened, where poetry is recited, chess played, and the affairs of the empire debated by men whose names will never appear in history books, and all of it runs on coffee. Now here's the boring bit, the part few people remember, and yet it quietly changed the world. The Ottoman Empire did not invent coffee, but it did perfect its ritual. Coffee came from Yemen, carried by Sufi mystics and Yemeni traders to the Red Sea port of Mocha. But in the 16th century, under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, coffee arrived in Istanbul, and the empire, as it so often did, absorbed it, reshaped it and gave it new purpose. The very first recorded coffee house in Istanbul opened around 1555, during Suleiman's reign. It was called Kiva Han, located in the Tahtakale district near the spice market. At first it attracted curious nobles and traveling scholars. Then came the poets, the scribes, the unemployed janissaries, the neighborhood gossips. Eventually, everyone came. It became, quite accidentally, a small engine of democracy, one that ran not on law but on conversation. No one was too rich or too poor to drink coffee. No one's opinion was too lofty or too trivial to be shared. In a society, Built on rigid hierarchy, palace over district, man over woman, Turk over Arab, the coffee house leveled the field just slightly. A baker might argue with a scholar, a soldier might correct a nobleman. And every word was held in the thick pause between sips. That's what made the Ottoman coffee house dangerous. The sultans knew it, the religious authorities too. The ulama often issued warnings about the corrupting influence of cafes. Coffee, they said, overstimulated the body and inflamed the mind. Worse, it gathered men in unsupervised places where rumors about the palace might spread like fire. Several times, in the 16th and 17th centuries, coffee houses were officially banned. Some were shut down, pots smashed, owners fined. But like a weed in the cobblestones, they returned, smaller, quieter, sometimes disguised as barber shops or tea rooms. People always found a way to gather. Some of the most powerful rebellions in Ottoman history began, not in barracks or palace halls, but over coffee. The 1622 revolt that deposed Sultan Osman II, it was whispered about in coffee houses first. The Janissaries who staged that uprising likely discussed their grievances. Between gulps of muddy cardamom-laced brew, and what of diplomacy? That came later, more refined, more calculated. By the 18th century, coffee had left the streets of Istanbul and entered the salons of Vienna and Paris. But even then, its Ottoman roots were never far. Ambassadors from the Sublime Porte learned to navigate European courts not with swords, but with silver trays and steaming pots. There is a famous anecdote, perhaps apocryphal but widely repeated, about Mehmet Efendi, the Ottoman envoy to France in 1721. Arriving in Paris, he hosted a reception for dozens of French nobles. Rather than bring political pamphlets or lavish gifts, he brought only coffee. Hand-roasted, slow-boiled, served in cups lined with gold thread. The nobles were enraptured, not by the beverage itself necessarily, but by the ritual, the silence before sipping, the respectful bows, the way the coffee clung to the tongue, heavy and bitter, forcing one to pause before speaking. That pause, Mehmet Efendi later remarked, is where diplomacy happens. Back in Istanbul, the cafes multiplied. By the 19th century, they were everywhere. Each neighborhood had at least one. Some were quiet and literary, others rowdy and political. Many were decorated simply with wooden benches, coal stoves, and walls darkened by years of tobacco smoke. And every one of them had a rhythm. The day began with coffee and reading. Mid-morning brought the first backgammon games. Afternoon saw the gathering of tradesmen, and as dusk approached, the storytellers came. They were called meda, men who memorized and recited epic tales, sometimes for hours, their voices rising and falling like old music. But even when the words stopped, the coffee remained, always strong, always hot, always sipped, never gulped. And so in the heart of one of the largest empires in history, the humble cafe became something greater than the sum of its parts. It became a kind of quiet parliament, a slow-burning library, a place where silk merchants and janissaries, poets and pilgrims met not as titles but as people, linked by the shared experience of warmth in a cup. So perhaps you wonder, as the coffee settles at the bottom of the cup, how did this bitter drink come to hold so much power? And in a world of shouting and urgency, how did something so quiet spark such change? Story 3. Coffee, Diplomacy, and the Quiet Power of the Ottoman Cafe. How did this bitter drink come to hold so much power? Let me walk you deeper into the winding lanes of Ottoman cities, through Bursa and Damascus, Aleppo and Sarajevo, where cafes weren't just places to drink, but spaces to think. Coffee houses followed trade routes and rivers, spreading like the scent of cardamom itself, from port to palace and beyond. And as they multiplied, so did the patterns of quiet revolution that traced themselves through steaming cups and hushed voices. By the late 17th century, coffee houses had settled into the rhythm of the empire. They weren't simply tolerated, they were expected. In towns where mosques marked the spiritual center and markets the economic one, the cafe became the unspoken third anchor, informal, unregulated, indispensable. They opened early, some before sunrise, lit by oil lamps, the air inside already filled with heat from stoves stoked to life. Wooden shelves held copper tesves and jars of beans from Yemen, Sidamo, or later even Java. The brewing itself was a ritual, always slow, never rushed. Water was drawn, sometimes from cisterns in courtyards, heated just below boiling, then poured over the fine powder of coffee, never stirred during heating, always allowed to froth and rise just once. Every detail mattered. To the outsider, this precision might have seemed fussy, but to the Ottomans it was art. Brewing coffee was like composing a short poem, simple in appearance, profound when done right. But it wasn't just the drink, it was the company. In a sleepy Anatolian village, you might find an imam sitting beside a carpenter, a retired soldier nodding along to a merchant's story about trade in Crete. Across the empire's many provinces, these humble spaces tied together the sprawling corners of Ottoman life. One traveler from the 18th century wrote in his diary about visiting a coffee house in Thessaloniki, where the room fell completely silent each time a man named Yusuf, a blind storyteller, began to speak. He tells tales of the prophet, yes, the traveler noted, but also of local fishermen, of markets gone awry, of a rooster that refused to crow until the new moon. People listened with a kind of reverence you might expect at court, and yet Yusuf wore shoes with holes in them and owned only one coat. Still, in that cafe for those hours, he ruled. These spaces were where news traveled fastest, faster than couriers, faster than decrees. Before telegraphs, cafes were the empire's informal wires. Someone would bring news from the docks in Izmir, say a failed grain shipment from Egypt. And within days, cafes as far as Edirne would be murmuring about rising bread prices. The government knew this and feared it. In fact, one of the quiet, bureaucratic rituals of the 18th and 19th centuries was the dispatch of plain-clothes scribes, essentially early surveillance agents, who'd sit in cafes and take mental notes. What were people saying about the Sultan? Were there jokes about taxes? Were any poems critical of the Janissaries? But the cafes were clever. Their power came not from open revolt, but from suggestion. Critiques were wrapped in riddles. Political. Gossip took the form of jokes about donkeys or drunk barbers. Everyone knew the meaning, yet no one could be accused of sedition outright. And what's perhaps most interesting, most quietly radical, is how the cafes handled time. In a world dominated by prayer hours, cannon salutes, and regimented military, Bells the cafe worked differently. You didn't arrive at a fixed time, you arrived when the day allowed. You didn't stay for a scheduled hour. You stayed for 1 cup or 3 or until the stories ended. The measure of time became internal. A conversation might stretch the afternoon. A chess game could last until lamps were lit, and the call to evening prayer echoed through the alleys. To step into a cafe was to step outside the rigid timeline of empire. Even when the world outside felt chaotic, rebellions, crop failures, wars, the cafe offered a tiny realm of peace and slow movement. You could almost forget the empire's machinery there. Almost, but even peace makes waves. One little-known moment occurred in 1807, just before the deposition of Sultan Selim III. That year, rumors began to circulate in the coffee houses of Istanbul that the Sultan had converted a mosque into an opera hall for French diplomats. The rumor was false, but it didn't matter. By the time palace officials attempted to correct the gossip, it had already hardened into truth in dozens of cafes. It stirred the Janissaries, already agitated over Selim's reforms, and contributed to the mood of suspicion that led to his downfall. All this from a single rumor stirred over a cup. Later, during the Tanzimat reforms of the mid-19th century, cafes again became staging grounds, not for protests or uprisings, but for thought. Reformers like Namık Kemal and Ziya Pasha were known to frequent certain cafes in Galata and Beyoğlu, sipping coffee quietly, talking literature, sketching, out visions for a more modern Ottoman Empire. These weren't secret meetings, they weren't particularly loud either. But what began as conversation over coffee slowly became essays, which became newspapers, which became policies. You see the pattern. Slow things, like coffee, have a way of reshaping fast empires. Even as Western-style salons grew popular among elites, the traditional Ottoman cafe remained untouched at the heart of daily life. From Cairo to Baghdad, Sarajevo to Damascus, you could still find the same low stools, the same bubbling pots, the same smell of roasted grounds curling into the morning air. One can't help but wonder, in an empire so vast, how did something so small as a cup become the great equalizer of daily life? And as the empire began to fade, was it the palaces that held memory, or the cafes? Story 3. Coffee, Diplomacy and the Quiet Power of the Ottoman Café 56. By the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was a shadow of its former size and power. The borders had receded, provinces were declaring independence or slipping into European control, and the once mighty sultans were navigating a world now ruled by railways, gunboats and foreign banks. But even as ministries modernized, as telegraphs crackled with urgent messages and warships bobbed in Bosphorus waters, the coffee houses still opened at dawn. They didn't change much, you know. Perhaps a new mirror on the wall, a few imported chairs, or a more modern stove. But the spirit remained unchanged. A narrow doorway opened onto another world, where politics, poetry, religion and weather could all be discussed with the same quiet intensity over the same bitter, foamy brew. The cafes had become keepers of memory, not state memory, not the grand narratives of conquests or treaties, but memory of the everyday. You'd walk in and hear an old man speak about the fire of 1870 that swept through Beyoğlu, how he and his brother carried water in buckets from a well. Someone would remember a bread shortage during the Crimean War. Another might recount how they once saw a Russian diplomat fall asleep in a cafe near the Topkapı gate because he'd eaten too much halva. These weren't moments you'd find in textbooks, but they were the fabric of life, the texture of an empire not in grand victories but in daily rhythms. The very layout of these cafes encouraged memory. Many had walls covered with old tools, faded photographs, calligraphy, or dusty books, stacked loosely in corners. You might find an old chessboard tucked behind a water jug, or a forgotten stringed instrument leaning near the door. All of it spoke quietly to continuity, and perhaps most tender of all were the rituals. Some cafes offered a sugar cube on a small porcelain dish alongside your cup, whether you used it or not. Others would bring a glass of water first, so you could clear the mouth before the coffee arrived. In Istanbul, it was common to receive a piece of Turkish delight, slightly stale, but always appreciated. The coffee came last, in a fincan barely larger than a thimble, hot enough to warm your hands before you dared sip. In the evenings, lamps flickered against stone walls. Shadows danced, and as the city quieted around you, time began to blur again. In these spaces, men and women, though often separated by tradition, shared more than stories. They passed down a kind of civic code, one that taught patience through slow brewing, attentiveness through conversation, and resilience through shared silence. Even the empire's enemies knew this. In 1917, during the waning years of Ottoman control, A British officer stationed in Jerusalem wrote in his journal, "The local cafe is more dangerous than the barracks. The men speak with kindness and courtesy, but they plant in one another a sense of dignity we cannot seem to shake loose." By then the empire's end was nearing. World War I would tear through its heartlands. The Arab revolt, Allied invasions, internal strife, famine, all would eat away at the foundation. The palaces would empty, the janissaries long gone, the maps redrawn. The Sultanate would dissolve, the Caliphate would follow. But as the empire collapsed outward, the cafes remained inward. One could still walk the alleys of Damascus and find a courtyard cafe open just after the morning call to prayer. In Sarajevo, locals still sipped jelva coffee brewed in small brass pots. In Istanbul, especially the older neighborhoods, some cafes had not closed in 100 years. And so, the last cup of the empire wasn't poured in a palace banquet or a banquet hall or even a war room. It was poured in silence, at dawn, likely by an old man with steady hands and a worn apron, while outside the first light touched the domes of mosques that had seen it all before. What remained after empire, you see, was habit, and habits are hard to conquer. Cafes continued into the era of the Republic. In fact, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk himself was known to drink thick Turkish coffee between cabinet meetings. The cafes changed in tone, more newspapers, fewer storytelling sessions, but they endured. And today, walk through the old cities of the former empire, Skopje, Cairo, Istanbul, Thessaloniki, Jerusalem, and you'll still find them. Not just cafes, but that kind of cafe. The kind where the chairs are slightly too low, the coffee slightly too strong, and the conversations slightly more important than they seem. It makes you wonder, in a world constantly rushing forward, is it possible that the most enduring legacies are those that unfold at the speed of conversation? Maybe empires fall, borders shift, and languages die out. But the small rituals remain. Someone still pours the water. Someone still tells the story. Someone still sips, slowly. And maybe, just maybe, the real shape of history isn't found in grand battles or golden thrones, but in a quiet cafe on a quiet morning where someone is stirring the grounds at the bottom of their cup, thinking quietly about what might come next. Story 4. The Janissary Who Played the Flute at Sunrise. The morning was always quietest, just before the drums began. That hour between the hush of night and the sun's first rays, when the city still slept beneath its domes, and dew clung to the stone courtyards, belonged not to the Sultan nor to generals but to the Meta. The Ottoman Janissary Band, the Meteran, was perhaps the most unexpected military force you'd encounter at dawn. Not because of their weapons, which were few, nor their armor, which by the 17th century had become largely ceremonial, but because of their sound. Let me take you to a time before alarm clocks, when the start of the day in the Ottoman capital was often announced by music. The Meta Band was no ordinary ensemble, formed initially as part of the personal guard of the Sultan. Its primary role was both ceremonial and psychological. It was designed not just to inspire Ottoman troops, but to intimidate enemy armies even before swords were drawn. Imagine, you're a young soldier stationed in the Balkans, and as darkness lifts you hear it, a pounding davul, a drum so large you feel it in your ribs more than hear it. Layered atop that, the bright, almost metallic call of zurnas, double reed wind instruments that cut through the air like trumpet fanfare. And somewhere in the background, soft but steady, the cues, giant, kettle drums played with padded sticks the size of clubs, and then, unexpectedly, a single ney flute, soft, somber, floating above the din like a prayer whispered to the wind. It was the voice of a man named Çelebi Halim, a janissary, who was known not for his swordplay or rank, but for the way he played. That flute, let me tell you about him. He wasn't born into the military. Like many Janissaries, Halim was recruited through the Devshirme system, a levy of Christian boys taken from the Balkans, converted to Islam, and trained to serve the Sultan. Halim's village was small, nestled in the green hills of what is now modern-day Kosovo. He'd been tending goats when the soldiers came. He was 10. At first he hated Istanbul, the noise, the rules, the constant training. But he found peace in music. Not the rowdy tavern songs sung by other boys in the barracks, but the haunting notes of the ney, a long reed flute used in Sufi ceremonies. He'd heard it played once by a dervish who passed by the Janissary school, and from that moment he was drawn to it. Eventually he found a discarded one, cracked, warped, barely playable, and taught himself. It was years before anyone noticed. But one morning, before a ceremonial parade, Halim played a simple melody outside the band's quarters. It wasn't loud, just a few notes carried on the early breeze. A Mehter commander heard it and turned his head. By noon, Halim was reassigned, not out of frontline training, but to the musicians' corps. Now, being in the Mehter wasn't easier work. If anything, it was harder. The instruments were heavy and their rhythms had to be perfect. Drummers drilled until their arms ached. Zurna players learned to breathe without ever fully pausing. Uniforms were hot, especially the massive felt hats-birks that towered over their heads like stiff turbans. And discipline was relentless, but it was a different kind of purpose. Halim rose before most always. He liked to walk the barracks grounds before the rest stirred, his flute wrapped in cloth under his robe. He'd sit by the edge of the courtyard, garden and play to himself, melodies that were soft, winding, often unresolved. No one spoke to him during these sessions. It became understood that this was his ritual. Eventually others began to listen. What made Halim different was not just his skill, it was his restraint. In a band known for volume and force, he played softly. He believed music could soothe as much as it could command. And while the drummers stirred soldiers to action, Halim's flute seemed to give them a reason to breathe. The Mehter band had always been about psychological warfare. When Ottoman forces advanced, the band led the march. When battles ended, the music played again, louder still. Even in retreat, the Mehter never stopped. Their constant rhythm gave the impression of unshaken resolve, no matter the truth. But within all that bluster, Halim's ney was something different. He played at sunrise parades when troops gathered in formation not for war, but for ritual. As the empire expanded east and west, the band traveled with it, performing not only on battlefields, but in foreign courts. In 1699, after the Treaty of Karlowitz, Halim was part of the delegation sent to the Habsburg court in Vienna. The Ottomans had suffered significant losses, and yet the Mehter still played, out of tradition or perhaps stubborn pride. Halim played his flute in the gardens of Schönbrunn Palace, under skeptical stares and curious whispers. His melody was simple, descending in thirds, mimicking the rhythm of breath. A European courtier wrote, "Their music is thunderous and crude, but the flute player, there is something mournful in his tone, as though he mourns a world we cannot see." Even there, in the heart of diplomatic defeat, Halim gave voice to the soul of an empire. It makes you wonder, was the Mehter meant only to terrify enemies, or had it become something more? A memory device, a living symbol, a heartbeat. When Halim returned to Istanbul, his fame had grown, but he remained quiet, private. He wrote no treatises, left no students. Only his flute, which he kept in a wooden box carved with the tukhra of Sultan Mustafa II, and as the 18th century dawned and the empire began its slow decline, Halim continued to play. At sunrise, at sunset, always before the drums, and always with the same question in his mind: Can a single note carry the memory of an entire empire? Story 4. The Janissary who played the flute at sunrise. The older Halim became, the quieter his music grew, in a time when every aspect of Ottoman military display was calibrated for maximum grandeur, from the polished shields to the towering meta. Drums, his restraint was almost rebellious, but no one rebuked him. In fact, quite the opposite. Halim had become a fixture in the Ottoman court, a symbol of dignity in a period increasingly defined by complexity and slow decay. By the early 1700s, the Ottoman Empire stood at a crossroads. It was no longer the unchallenged power it had been. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, internal politics had grown turbulent. Western powers, especially the Habsburgs and Russians, had developed militaries that could match, if not outpace, the Ottoman system. But there was still the ceremony. Still the performance. The Mehteran, though often viewed by outsiders as purely martial musicians, had become central to the empire's self-image. They were part of imperial parades, public holidays, coronation ceremonies, religious festivals, and official greetings for foreign envoys. Their uniforms were splendid. Bright crimson robes, white sashes, golden embroidery on green tunics. The spectacle remained. So did the sound, but as the centuries turned, the function of sound itself began to change. For Halim, this transformation was more than symbolic. It was personal. He no longer marched with the younger men. He wasn't strong enough for that, nor was it expected of him. Instead, he was assigned to intimate performances. Quiet morning sessions in the imperial gardens, twilight ceremonies within Topkapı's inner courtyards, or post-prayer interludes in small tiled rooms where viziers gathered to speak privately. There, Halim's flute became a kind of instrument of transition. It's hard to explain unless you've heard a ney in person. The instrument doesn't shout, it breathes. It moans softly, gliding between tones like mist rising off the Bosphorus. In the hands of a skilled player, it becomes more than music. It becomes conversation. Halim didn't play for applause. He played between the lines. Viziers often used his presence strategically. It's said that during one difficult negotiation in 1705, a dispute over naval spending nearly erupted into a shouting match among the Sultan's advisers. Halim, seated in the corner, began to play without being asked. No announcement, no fanfare. Just a gentle, low melody. The tone shifted. The advisers paused. Breath slowed, the argument softened. In the end, no resolution was reached that day, but no tempers flared either. You see, in a time before mindfulness seminars and conflict de-escalation manuals, Halim's flute filled that role. He was, in many ways, the empire's unofficial therapist, though no one used that word. Even common folk knew him. He would sometimes play on Fridays near the fountain of Ahmed III, not far from the palace gates. People gathered, not in crowds. He didn't like attention, but in quiet groups. Market vendors, scribes, schoolboy skipping lessons. He didn't perform concerts. He occupied space, just a presence, reed in hand, eyes downcast. Some said he could summon birds with his notes. Others swore that cats, usually feral and aloof, would curl up near his feet while he played. Perhaps it was superstition. Perhaps, not one story, likely apocryphal though beloved, tells of a European ambassador who tried to commission Halim to join his personal ensemble abroad. The man offered gold, land, even a title. Halim reportedly smiled and replied, "I already play for a world larger than your own." That world, however, was changing fast. The Janissaries, once elite warriors and protectors of the Sultan, had grown increasingly corrupt. By the mid-18th century, their political influence was resented. Their barracks became places of intrigue, and their loyalty grew uncertain. Meanwhile, European armies adopted new training methods and modern tactics. The Ottoman military was falling behind. and the mater, once seen as a terrifying signal of Ottoman strength, became a curiosity, an echo of the past. Foreign observers wrote both mockingly and admiringly about the band. French travellers marvelled at the size of the drums. British officers joked that the music sounded like a thunderstorm dragged through copper pipes. Some compared it to a medieval war hymn, others were more poetic. A Polish envoy, upon hearing Halim perform during a lull in negotiations, wrote, "His flute speaks not to victory but to memory. It does not shout of empire, it sighs for it." By this point, Halim was in his 60s, a rare age among Janissaries. He had no family, no permanent home beyond a modest room near the Suleymaniye mosque, but he was never lonely. His days followed a sacred rhythm: early morning prayer, tea with fellow musicians, mid-morning performances, then solitude. His flute remained in immaculate condition, though visibly worn from decades of play. The mouthpiece had been shaped by his breath alone. The reed, replaced over the years, was always carved by Halim himself, with careful attention to curvature and tone. He believed each flute held a spirit, and in the final years of his life Halim began to play only at night. It puzzled many. Why give up sunrise, the hour he was best known for? Some say he found morning too loud now, too many new people, too many voices. Others claim he preferred the quiet of the stars. He would walk the palace gardens alone under the waxing moon and play to no one in particular. Guards knew not to disturb him. Cats followed him. The soft shuffle of his sandals could be heard along the marble corridors, then silence, then song. Those nights became legend. It wasn't uncommon to find junior scribes or cooks sneaking into the garden just to hear Halim play beneath the cypress trees. Some sat on steps. Others leaned against fountains. No one dared speak. One final winter, cold, sharp, bitter, he didn't play for weeks. Rumors spread. Illness, retirement. Some feared he had died quietly, without ceremony. But then one night, just after the call to the last prayer, the music returned. Not a triumphant march, not a festive melody. Just a slow, spiraling song that seemed to fold in on itself. Some say it was the same tune he played that first morning outside the Janissary school, the one that had earned him his place in the mater decades earlier. It was, as always, unresolved. That night, Halim left his flute on a bench in the garden. Wrapped in cloth, still warm from his hands, he was never seen again. No grand funeral, no imperial decree, just a story told by a few watchmen and an aging drummer who remembered a man who once played at sunrise. Today, that flute resides in a glass case deep inside the Istanbul Military Museum, labelled only Ney 17th century Janissary band. But if you press your ear close, you almost hear it, the last sigh of a world waking up, or perhaps the first whisper of one quietly fading away. The morning after Halim disappeared, the gardens of Topkapı Palace felt unusually still. It wasn't that the birds had stopped singing or the trees had shed their rustling language. It was that something was missing, and no one quite knew how to name it. The palace had witnessed the passing of many officials, generals, and court musicians, but few had ever left without a sound. Halim had been more than a musician. He had been a metronome of memory, a gentle counterpoint to the empire's bombast. His ney, the simple reed flute, was never intended for grandeur, yet somehow, in the heart of a once mighty empire, it became an anchor. But the Ottoman world had already begun to shift beneath its own weight. By the early 19th century, the Janissary cause itself was no longer the revered elite of past centuries. Their political meddling and resistance to military modernization had turned them into symbols of decay. The empire, desperate to reform, faced a dilemma: preserve tradition or step into a new, uncertain age. In 1826, under Sultan Mahmud II, that question was answered with violence. It was called the Auspicious Incident, a euphemistic name for one of the more drastic restructurings in Ottoman history. After years of failed reforms and growing unrest, Mahmud ordered the eradication of the Janissaries, literally. On June 15th, Janissary barracks were surrounded. When the soldiers resisted, artillery fire was unleashed. Fires swept through their quarters. Survivors were hunted, exiled, or executed. By nightfall, an institution that had shaped the empire for centuries was gone, and with it, the Meta. The military band that had marched across Europe, played before sultans, and accompanied Halim through the gardens of his youth, was disbanded. Instruments were smashed, robes burned. Music, once essential to Ottoman identity, was labeled antiquated. Western-style bands would replace them, outfitted in neat uniforms, playing structured marches with clarinets and trumpets. And yet, not all was lost. The ney never disappeared. Quiet instruments like Halim's flute found new homes in Sufi lodges and tea-houses. Their melodies survived not on battlefields or royal parades, but in back rooms lined with carpets and flickering oil lamps. Sufi mystics would play the ney during dhikr, ritual remembrance of God, its long breathy notes echoing like prayers held in a wind tunnel. Some claimed that Halim had spent his final days among the Mevlevis, the dervishes who whirled in Konya. Others said he had walked eastward, toward the rising sun, and simply never looked back. No record confirms it, but what is known is that about 50 years later, during the 1870s, an elderly craftsman named Davut found a wrapped bundle of reed hidden in the rafters of an abandoned Janissary outpost near Istanbul. Inside was a ney, and carved into its side, barely visible, were the words, "To wake the world gently." Davut, who had never played a note in his life, felt compelled to learn. It took him years, but eventually his modest home became a place where young apprentices came to sit, sip tea, and listen. The music wasn't fast. It wasn't even in tune, most of the time, but it held a kind of patience. Davut died in 1912, and his students brought the flute to the newly founded Istanbul Conservatory. There historians traced it back to a Janissary lineage. One scholar, obsessed with meta music, remembered an old name, Halim. And so, through a strange folding of time, Halim's sound returned, not as a fanfare, but as a reconstruction. The Metaran was revived piece by piece after the fall of the Ottoman Empire in the 1920s. As the new Republic of Turkey sought to preserve its cultural heritage, certain traditions were reintroduced, not as military necessities, but as historical echoes. The Meta Band now plays in ceremonies and festivals, not on the battlefield, and yet even now they open with a low flute. It's not always noticed. The crowd tends to focus on the kettle drums and zurnas, the bright reds and booming rhythm, but if you listen closely, tucked beneath the noise, a knee hums. Somewhere between the second and third beat, just before the drums rise into their crescendo, you hear it, a whisper, a breath pulled through an ancient reed, a single note that doesn't ask to be heard, but lingers nonetheless. I visited the Istanbul Military Museum once, hoping to see Halim's flute for myself. It's there in a glass case, barely labeled. Most people walk past without pausing. It doesn't glitter or shine. No plaque boasts of its importance. But I stood there for a long while, and I imagined him, barefoot in the palace garden, head bowed, cat circling near his ankles, the first orange rays of dawn kissing the marble at his feet. He wasn't a hero. He didn't win wars or negotiate peace treaties, but he offered stillness when the world needed it. And sometimes that's the only kind of bravery history forgets to honor. The question, then, is not whether Halim changed the empire. He didn't. But did he change the way it remembered itself? Did his morning songs seep into the minds of soldiers long after the march had ended? Did some weary janissary, knee-deep in Balkan snow, carry the soft memory of a flute to keep the cold at bay? We'll never know, but I like to think the answer is yes. That buried somewhere in the folds of an empire's decline was the sound of a man who never raised a sword, never led a charge, just breathed softly into the morning air and let the world listen. And maybe in the quiet of your own morning someday, you'll remember him, not for the music, but for the silence that came after. Story 5. The night the water clock broke in Taqi al-Din's observatory. Let me take you back to a moment often overlooked, not a battlefield, not a coronation, but a quiet evening in the year 1577, inside a small circular room perched above the ancient hills of Constantinople. Outside, the city moved as it always did. Merchants haggled in the Grand Bazaar, fishermen pulled nets from the Bosphorus, and the call to prayer lingered over the rooftops like a woven echo. But here, in a domed chamber of Taqi al-Din's imperial observatory, a man sat beside a bowl of dripping water, just listening, not to stars or comets, not even to silence, but to time itself, dripping, measured, captured one droplet at a time. It sounds strange now, doesn't it, that the ticking of a water clock might hold the key to the cosmos. But back then, the universe didn't unfold by seconds or minutes. It arrived in pulses. A star appeared here, a moon shadow lengthened there, and in that little round room above the city, time fell from a pipe and splashed quietly in a shallow brass bowl. One drop, then another. Taqi al-Din, the court astronomer to Sultan Murad III, was not your ordinary man of science. His beard was long and untrimmed, his eyes sunken but alert, as though perpetually watching something only he could see. When he spoke, it was often in numbers, and when he prayed, he did so not just for clarity, but for accuracy. You see, unlike most Islamic scholars of his time, Taqi al-Din believed that faith and reason not only belonged together, they depended on each other. He read the Quran in the morning and recorded lunar parallax in the afternoon. His observatory, a circular compound nestled in the Galata Hills, had been approved by the Sultan himself, a rare and risky investment. It housed telescopes, sextants, mural quadrants, and, of course, the famous water clock. This clock wasn't just decorative, it was his control center, his way of aligning earthly time with celestial rhythms. Most clocks of the time were mechanical or driven by weights, but water offered something different. It offered consistency, at least in theory. And so, each night, Taqi would calibrate his instruments based on that quiet drip, adjusting for humidity, temperature, and gravity's subtle pull. The room was dim. Light filtered in through high slits in the stone. Candles were discouraged, their smoke interfered with lenses, and their flickering made it hard to mark measurements precisely. So there he sat, this old astronomer, pencil in hand, eyes glancing from the bowl to the sky. Outside, the stars wheeled, but inside, all that mattered was whether that next drop would fall exactly on the mark. But then, something unusual happened. That night the water didn't drip, it trickled. At first, Taqi thought it was condensation. Maybe the bowl hadn't cooled enough. But when he looked closer, he saw it, a hairline crack, running along the copper base of the container. The water was no longer falling in droplets. It was leaking slowly, messily, unpredictably. He froze. This was not just a broken clock. This was his metronome, his anchor, his temporal compass. Without it, his calculations would unravel. His readings, taken over months, might be rendered useless. For a moment he simply stared, not with panic, but with the strange, slow recognition that something important had been interrupted. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever had a system so precise, so personal, that its failure felt like a betrayal. A calendar lost? A favorite pen stolen? A habit disrupted? That's what this was for Taki. He didn't shout. He didn't pace. Instead, he pulled his notebook closer and made a single note. Clock leaking. Replace. Night disrupted. That was all. Then he closed the journal, stood up from the stool, and for the first time in weeks, walked outside. The garden surrounding the observatory wasn't large, just a small ring of cypress and juniper. But in that moment, it must have felt endless. The air smelled of wet soil and cold stone. Somewhere down in the city, a ship's bell clanged. A mule brayed. The world ticking on in its own time, and there, beneath the dome of stars he spent his life measuring, Taki al-Din looked up without calculating. The moon was bright and round, casting gentle silver over the minarets in the distance. The stars were still there, exactly where they were supposed to be. Nothing had shifted. Nothing had collapsed, except perhaps his sense of control. But maybe that's what the night was trying to teach him. Maybe the drip of time doesn't always arrive with perfect spacing. Maybe the cosmos, measurable as it may seem, is still allowed its moments of unpredictability. The broken water clock wasn't the end of the world. It was the beginning of a new question. He returned inside eventually, wrapped the cracked bowl in linen, set it aside like a wounded friend. And then, instead of cancelling his observations for the night, he did something rare. He estimated, he guessed, and in the margins of his logbook he wrote, "Observed without clock, still beautiful." You might wonder what happened next. Did he repair the clock the following day? Did his calculations continue uninterrupted? Did anyone else even notice? We'll find out soon. But for now, let the image linger. A man seated beneath the stars, his tools briefly failing him, and yet he continues, not with panic but with presence, and that in the end may have been the more accurate measurement. The next morning, the observatory was quiet in the way only institutions of precision can be, where every footstep echoes too loud, every breath feels out of place, and every beam of sunlight seems to intrude upon the sacred order of data. Taki al-Din arrived before dawn, not because he was a morning man, though he had often claimed so to his students, but because his mind hadn't rested. All night he had replayed that moment when the water began to seep rather than fall, not just a mechanical flaw, but a rupture in rhythm. And when rhythm fails in a science of cycles, everything else begins to slip. You must understand, the observatory wasn't just his lab. It was a dream-made stone, a circular tower rising out of the hills of Galata, like a lone astronomical minaret. Built under the generous, if not entirely enthusiastic, support of Sultan Murad III, it had cost more than anyone expected, not just in coin, but in trust. There were murmurs at court, whispers that astronomy was dangerously close to astrology, and that stargazers often wandered too far into predictions best left to God. But Taki al-Din had persisted. He had won the Sultan's ear with talk of calendars, eclipses, and accurate prayer times. He had promised a new golden age of Ottoman science, and for a few brief years he had been believed. That morning, after the clock's failure, he stood in the observatory's central room with his arms behind his back, studying the row of instruments, the armillary sphere, the azimuth circle, the massive mural quadrant, each one perfectly aligned, pointing skyward, silent. But to him, none of them mattered, unless they could be trusted. And trust began with time. Replacing the water clock wasn't impossible. But precision clocks, true ones, were rare, and custom-built ones even more so. The broken bowl would have to be reforged by copper artisans in the city, and then retested, recalibrated, reapproved. Weeks, perhaps. He didn't have weeks. Word had already begun to flutter, like unwanted pigeons at the edge of the dome. Court officials were asking for results, charts, predictions, proof that the observatory was not just a pretty tower with long shadows and expensive toys, and, perhaps most unsettling of all, Taki had recently received a visit from a palace official, whose smile didn't quite reach his eyes. His Majesty wonders, the man had said carefully, if the stars you study still point toward divine favor. Taki had bowed deeply and replied with all the dignity he could muster. They point always to the order of creation, nothing more, nothing less. But he knew the tone. He recognized the caution wrapped in courtly language. His work was being awayed, and worse, it might be found wanting, so he did what any astronomer desperate to preserve his data would do. He built a workaround. In the small antechamber near the observatory's western alcove, he gathered 3 students, young men, with keen eyes and steadier nerves than he gave them credit for. They were apprentices, yes, but more than that, they were believers in the grand idea, that humans, through discipline and study, could read the heavens, not like oracles, but like scribes, carefully, humbly, with ink-stained fingers and patient hands. He assigned each of them a task, one to measure shadow lengths with the gnomon, another to record celestial positions based on moonrise intervals, and the third, perhaps the most curious method of all, to listen. He had crafted a makeshift water timer out of 2 clay pitchers and a reed funnel. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't particularly scientific, but it dripped more or less every 4 seconds. Every 25 drips, Taki said, mark the star's position again. The apprentice hesitated. But how will we know the time between? We won't, Taki said gently, but we'll begin to feel it. And so, night after night, the observatory became less a machine and more a body. Each student, like a lung or a heartbeat, contributing rhythm where the clock once ruled. You might think that sounds imprecise, and it was. But strangely, the records didn't degrade. In fact, some calculations grew more careful. Errors were caught more quickly. Assumptions were questioned more openly. It was as if, by removing the illusion of mechanical perfection, the observatory had rediscovered its humanity. There was a beauty in it, a shared labor, a warmth, and Taki, for all his mathematical rigor, began to understand something new. That sometimes, in seeking the stars, we must first learn to listen to the quiet within ourselves. Of course, this did not escape notice. Rumors reached the palace that the great observatory was now being run by apprentices with clay pots, that the astronomer priest had abandoned his precision for poetry, that perhaps the court's money was being spent on metaphors, not measurements, and so once again an envoy came, this time not with veiled warnings, but with silence, a sealed letter, a royal summons. Taki read it without expression, folded it once, and without a word returned to the dripping pitcher. It was still steady, still imperfect, still enough. He told his students he'd be gone a few days, asked them to continue, to watch the skies, to keep recording, even if the tools grew. Dull or the nights too long? Why? One of them asked. If they don't believe in this work, why do we go on? Taki paused before answering, then smiled faintly, because the stars do not change when men stop looking at them. And with that, he left the observatory. The streets below were noisy that afternoon. Caravans from Damascus rolled through the gates. Vendors called out bread prices. Children chased each other down the cobblestone alleys. The city was alive in all its mundane, chaotic glory, and yet above it all that tower still stood. Quiet, intentional. A place where time had once been caught, drop by drop, and now was held, together by faith and listening. Taki reached the palace in time for evening court. Sultan Murad III was not unkind, but neither was he indulgent. Surrounded by advisors, poets, and clerics, He had grown wary of the sciences that yielded no immediate reward. Taki bowed low and waited. The Sultan's voice was calm. "Your observatory has served well, we are told. But now, we ask, what has it shown us that prayer has not?" A dangerous question, not because it was hostile, but because it demanded utility. Taki answered carefully. "It has shown us that the heavens move, not for us, but around us, that we are part of a system vast and precise, and that even when our clocks break, the stars remain loyal." There was a long pause. One advisor whispered something, another shook his head, a third yawned, and the Sultan only said, "Loyalty is useful." Then he dismissed the court. Taki returned to Galata under cover of moonlight. The students were still at their posts, the pitchers were still dripping, the night was cold and clear, and as he climbed the stairs to the dome, he thought not of glory or failure, but of rhythm, the kind that comes from persistence, not perfection. The stars that night were unusually bright, above the hills of Galata, beyond the lattice of old rooftops, and the shivering silhouettes of minarets, the heavens stretched out in clear, glistening arcs. Constellations moved along their predictable paths, silent, eternal, indifferent to human affairs. Inside the dome of the observatory, Taki al-Din stood once more before the great mural quadrant. His hand hovered over the long brass arc, not measuring, not correcting, just feeling the cool weight of the metal. His students were asleep on woolen mats nearby, cloaks pulled tightly over their shoulders. The clay water timer had stopped. Its final drop had fallen hours ago. He hadn't restarted it. Not tonight. There had been rumors, louder now, not just whispers, in the palace halls, but proclamations from the Friday pulpits, that the observatory had become a distraction, that it dealt in magic, not reason, that its towers were too close to heaven and too far from devotion. One preacher in particular, a man of rising influence, had declared during prayer that no tower built by man should presume to touch what God has veiled in mystery. And in an empire where religion and power walked side by side, that statement was no small breeze. It was a gust, strong enough to knock over even stone. Taki al-Din knew what was coming. The Sultan had not called him back. No further questions had been asked. No demands for new charts, no requests for predictions, just silence. And in the quiet, the fate of the observatory had already been written. Still, he had returned, night after night, not to salvage glory or to protest the tide of change, but because something within him still needed to look up, still needed to listen. That final evening, he opened his leather-bound journal and wrote a single entry. It was not a data point, not a calculation, just a thought. Even when the clock breaks, the stars remain faithful. Perhaps that is enough for now. By morning, the order had arrived. The Sultan, under pressure from both religious advisers and political skeptics, had decreed the closure and demolition of the Istanbul Observatory. It was to be dismantled stone by stone. The instruments, if salvageable, would be sent to libraries or stored in royal archives. Some would disappear entirely. No public ceremony marked its end. No inscription recorded its brief existence. Just a few days later, the observatory was gone. Its dome, which had once housed Taki's greatest dreams, was now only sky. But that is not where this story ends. Because while stone can crumble and brass can tarnish, ideas are more difficult to erase. For years afterward, Taki al-Din's name was spoken in soft tones across the intellectual households of Damascus, Cairo, and beyond. His works, The Tree of the Lunar Compass, the brightest stars on the construction of clocks, continued to circulate quietly. Copies made their way to scholars who had never seen the dome in Galata, but felt its echo in the pages. One particularly curious text was his treatise on mechanical timekeeping, where he proposed using gear trains powered by springs rather than water, a concept that would, years later, mirror the pendulum advances in Europe. Another work, filled with detailed lunar observations, became a reference point for Ottoman calendrical reform, long after the observatory had vanished from official records. But perhaps the most lasting legacy wasn't what Taki wrote, but how he worked. See, he had taught a generation of students to question gently, to observe patiently, and to endure when progress was not welcomed. Many of them went on to become quiet innovators, mathematicians, engineers, even court architects, who carried a small part of the observatory within them. And centuries later, when the Ottoman Empire began to rediscover its scientific roots, in the 18th and 19th centuries, historians would look back and rediscover the name Taqi al-Din, not as a magician or a mystic, but as one of the last great Islamic astronomers before a long silence. There's something poetic in that, isn't there? That a man who lost his instruments and his tower, whose great water clock gave out in the dead of night, would still be heard across time, not because he changed the world, but because he tried to measure it faithfully. And so, what does it mean that his clock failed? What does it mean that the Sultan stopped believing? Perhaps it means nothing, or perhaps it reminds us that history is not only shaped by success, but by the calm, persistent effort to make sense of things, even when no one is watching. Tonight, if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. Again, a faint drip, a quiet page turning, a figure at the edge of a dome looking up, not to predict, not to control, but simply to witness. And isn't that, in the end, enough? Story 6. The Beekeeper of Mount Erciyes. Let me take you far away from cities, from domes and towers and sultans. Let us drift instead to a slope, not of marble or politics, but of stone and snow, to a volcanic mountain that doesn't erupt anymore, but once did, to a village so small it doesn't appear on most maps, and to a man whose life, as far as official record goes, never made a single ripple. His name was Yusuf the beekeeper. You've likely never heard of him. Most haven't, but in the late 1600s, when the Ottoman Empire still spanned 3 continents, Yusuf tended to a world far smaller. He kept hives along the eastern face of Mount Erciyes, the towering snow-capped mountain that rises near Kayseri, like a silent god, unmoving, windswept, timeless. Erciyes is the kind of mountain that seems to hold its breath. In summer, wildflowers spread in ripples of yellow and violet. In winter, the drifts grow so deep you can barely find the outline of the footpaths. But in spring, that brief moment when frost melts just enough to let the bees stir, you could hear the whole slope come alive. That was Yusuf's season. Each March he would light the smoke pots, little clay burners filled with dried herbs and branches, just enough to calm the bees before opening the wooden hives. His hands, wrapped in sheepskin, moved with surprising delicacy for a man who had lost 3 fingers in a cart accident as a boy. He never wore gloves, though. He claimed the bees could feel the cloth and didn't like it. No one argued. The truth is most villagers didn't go near Yusuf's hives at all, not out of fear, but because beekeeping, especially at that altitude, was considered peculiar. Necessary, perhaps, but not noble. While merchants kept ledgers and scribes copied court orders, Yusuf listened to buzzing. But what makes this man worthy of our time, your time tonight, is not that he raised bees, it's how he did it, and why the empire, in a strange twist, quietly depended on men like him. You see, by the end of the 17th century, the Ottomans were exporting wax, not just honey, though that too, but beeswax. Clean, white, slow-burning wax that was essential for lighting mosques, preserving manuscripts, sealing royal decrees, and even waterproofing the rigging of ships in the Ottoman fleet. Candles in Topkapi Palace, Ottoman bees. Seals on diplomatic scrolls to Venice or Poland. Ottoman wax, naval lanterns in the Aegean. Again, bees. But good wax required clean hives, strong colonies, and altitude. The colder the winters, the fewer. The mites. The more isolated the bees, the purer the yield, which is why inspectors from the Provincial Guild of Waxmongers would ride up from Kayseri twice a year, cloaks flapping like sails, just to check Yusuf's hives. And every time he passed, he didn't speak much to the guildman, not because he was rude, but because he didn't care for the gold scales they used, or the questions they asked about hive weight. He would answer politely, show them the wax bricks stacked in dry clay sheds, then retreat to his main apiary, where he kept a logbook of blooming patterns, carefully sketched by hand. Each entry began the same. First flight spotted. Wind, light. Bloom, not yet. Smoke level, gentle. It's strange to think that one of the most accurate records of microclimate behavior on the mountain from that era comes not from a meteorologist, but from a beekeeper with half a hand and a head full of flowers. One entry, dated April 1693, notes a strange occurrence. Snowmelt late, no crocus bloom, bees aggressive, wax turned dark. That detail alone would later puzzle an imperial official who studied supply chain disruptions in candle production. Turns out, the entire spring shipment from Yusuf's region had been off-color, harder to dye, more brittle when rolled. No one could explain it. Except Yusuf, who had simply noted it and moved on. He didn't seek answers for the empire. He just watched the bees. What fascinates me, and perhaps what might stir something in you too, is how someone so small in the web of empire could still hold up an invisible beam of it. That without Yusuf and dozens like him scattered across the highlands, the soft glow in palace halls might have flickered. The seals might not have held. The ships might have taken on water. But Yusuf never knew. That he lived in a one-room stone house with a goat and 2 wooden stools. His bees lived better. He built their hives like little mansions, angled for morning sun, protected from the wind, with drainage canals carved into the stone base. He named the colonies after stars: Aldebaran, Vega, Sirius. Let them feel grand, he once told the apothecary who brought him salt and bandages. They carry more weight than I do. It wasn't a complaint, it was a truth. He took more care building the hives than the people of his own village took in building their homes. There were no blueprints, no rulers, just hands, stones, and instinct. Yet when an earthquake struck the region a few years later, many houses cracked. Yusuf's hives held. Some even said they buzzed louder after. No one knew why, but I suppose that's the nature of slow, unnoticed mastery. You do something quietly for years. You tend, repair, watch, and listen. No one applauds you. No one commissions a statue. But when the quake hits, or the wax turns dark, you're the only one who already has the answer. As spring deepened that year, Yusuf's entries grew more detailed. May 3rd. Bees circled low before landing. Temperature shift, 2 colonies requeened. Smoke not needed today. May 18th. Rain, no flight, wax has light sheen, color returning. There's something touching about these notes. No pretense, no grand theory. Just careful daily observation, born not of fame or duty, but devotion. A quiet partnership between man and swarm. And yet, the more I reread these entries, the more I wonder, did Yusuf know? Did he understand even vaguely that his wax was reaching the halls of Topkapi, that his dark spring wax would puzzle a tax minister, that naval rigging might fail without his bees? Or did he simply sip his honeyed tea in the evening, watching the mountain go purple, content to let the empire happen far away? It's hard to say, but I can tell you this much. In the guild's archive, there is one complaint, filed by a rival beekeeper from a nearby village. He claimed Yusuf was stubborn and uncooperative, unwilling to share hive-building methods. The complaint was dismissed. The wax, after all, spoke for itself. Still, one wonders, why didn't Yusuf ever train an apprentice? Why didn't he write more than weather logs? And what happened exactly during the long winter that followed his last recorded note? October 12th, first frost. Smoke pots away, bees sealed in. Snow will come early. There are no entries after that. No inspection records, no guild visits, no mentions in court, just silence. So what became of Yusuf, the beekeeper who outlived? Earthquakes soothed swarms and steadied a tiny sliver of empire. When snow finally swallowed the upper paths of Mount Erciyes that year, it came not in waves, but all at once. Villagers remembered it because of the way it fell, silently, steadily, like the mountain had drawn a curtain between itself and the rest of the world. By mid-November, even the goats refused to climb higher than the lower slopes. By December, no one even mentioned Yusuf. That's not unusual. Beekeepers weren't exactly headline news in the 17th century. They were men who preferred listening over speaking, who moved through life with the rhythm of the seasons. When they disappeared for winter, people assumed they'd reappear with the crocus blooms. But this time, Yusuf didn't. Come March, a boy from the village, sent to fetch dried resin Yusuf would usually sell, was the first to spot it. The apiary was still intact. The stone hives sat in their usual crescent formation. But something was missing. There was no smoke. Not a single clay pot had been lit, and the silence wasn't peaceful. It was sterile, the kind of quiet that makes your ears buzz. Inside his small hut, the door hung slightly ajar. No signs of a break-in. No damage, just layers of dust across the wooden stool, an old cold hearth, and on the table his logbook, open to that final October entry. October 12th, first frost. Smoke pots away. Bees sealed in. Snow will come early. And nothing more. They found him eventually, not far from the upper meadow, just past a dry creek bed, slumped beneath a low-hanging pine, wrapped in his own beekeeping cloak. His satchel had been left open, a few sprigs of thyme and bark samples. Inside, along with an empty jar of honey and some half-written notes, no sign of injury. No predators, just a man who had walked into the wild as if to check on something and never walked back. There was a short ceremony. The imam from the village said a few words. No family to claim the body. The guild was notified, and a clerk, probably new, wrote one line into the records: Yusuf the beekeeper of Erciyes deceased. Hive assets pending review. That could have been the end, but then the spring wax never came. In April, ships delayed their departure from Izmir due to a wax shortage. Ottoman archives show that 3 court scribes requested an extension on copying legal scrolls because they lacked adequate light to work past dusk. Even in the kitchens of Topkapi Palace, records show that sweetmeats were sealed with cloth, not wax. Not a disaster, but a disruption. Their quiet, widespread inconvenience, and the missing piece, it turned out, wasn't the bees. It was how Yusuf kept them. When inspectors finally rode up to catalogue the property, they were baffled, not because of the hives themselves, but because of what was hidden behind them. You see, Yusuf had built something entirely unique, a terraced system of microclimate hive rows, each aligned not by sun alone, but by wind pattern and blooming altitude. He had mapped, on bark scrolls and stone, over a dozen species of wildflowers, correlating their bloom windows with bee temperament, wax coloration, and yield longevity. None of this was known to the guild, because Yusuf had never told them. He'd never published, never lectured, never mentored. His techniques, years ahead of their time, lived only in his hands, and in the bees that now, without their keeper, began to drift. The hives started collapsing by midsummer. Without the smoke rituals, the parasite checks, the wax drainage techniques, small things that seemed tedious but meant everything, the bees grew agitated. Colonies swarmed, fled, died. By autumn, what had been one of the Empire's most reliable wax outputs had all but vanished. One might think, well, surely they rebuilt it. They tried. But when the guild sent a replacement, a younger beekeeper from Sivas, trained in the newer hiving methods, he couldn't replicate the output. His wax was too soft, too dark, too uneven. In a rare admission, the guild wrote in its internal memo, "The hives of Ersies, in their original function and output, cannot be restored by standard means. Their keepers' methods were singular and insufficiently documented." Which brings us to something quietly profound. The Ottoman Empire had a bureaucracy famed for its obsessive record-keeping. It could tell you how many sheep grazed a pasture near Aleppo in 1573, or how many bolts of silk entered Damascus from Bursa in any given year, but it could not, despite its grandeur, replicate the silent knowledge of one man and his bees. Yusuf, with his few fingers, hand-built hives, and crooked cloak had left behind a gap that no ledger could fill. And what did the village say? Not much. Some blamed the wolves, though they hadn't seen any. Others whispered he'd simply grown tired, that the winter or the silence or both had finally beckoned louder than the bees. But one story lingered. A herder claimed he saw Yusuf on his final day, said he was standing at the crest of the slope staring into the fog, not moving, just watching. When asked why he didn't call out to him, the herder shrugged. He looked like he was listening for something, and maybe he was. There's one theory, unsupported, undocumented, but strangely poetic, that Yusuf had spent that final year noticing something the rest of the world had not, that perhaps the bees were behaving differently, that something subtle was changing in the flowers, and rather than disrupt their rhythm or force his knowledge onto the next man, he chose to let it go quiet. We'll never know, of course, but one last detail remains. Inside his hut, tucked under the floorboards, they found a single beeswax tablet, engraved with a simple design. A bee perched on a star, wings open, legs curled under as if in rest. It wasn't labeled. No note. Just that image. It now sits, dust-covered, unlit, on a shelf in the Kayseri Municipal Archive. Most visitors pass it without even noticing, but if you lean close, they say you can still smell the faintest sweetness, and so the empire moved on. Candles were imported. Guild standards changed. Beeswax continued to flow, though never quite as brightly. Yusuf faded into footnotes, into whispers, into the thin air above the mountain. And yet, I wonder, what else, what quiet knowledge still lies hidden in old huts, folded in logbooks or sealed in forgotten wax tablets? If you had walked through the lower valleys of Mount Erciyes in the summer, after Yusuf's passing, you would have seen a kind of strange emptiness that had nothing to do with bees. The hives were still there, many of them intact. The stone paths he carved remained, winding gently through stands of thyme and lavender. The terraced slopes, once golden with buzzing life, stood hushed. The villagers avoided the trail, not out of fear, but because of something harder to name, a kind of respect, or perhaps a reverence born from not fully understanding what was lost. But here's the part most records won't tell you. Yusuf's absence sparked a quiet ripple in circles far beyond the mountain. Word had reached the capital, first in whispers among guild scribes, then in notes passed between scholars. One professor from the Madrasa in Bursa, intrigued by the reports of unreplicable wax quality, made the journey to Kayseri. Another came the following spring, driven by a curiosity about how a single man could so alter the chemical texture of candlelight. These weren't grand academics, mind you, just curious men, cartographers of forgotten things. They poked through the ash in Yusuf's fireplace. They measured the slopes of his terraces. They even tried painstakingly to reconstruct one of his wax extraction systems from diagrams. Carved into a wall beam, but there was always something missing because Yusuf didn't write like they did. His notes were cryptic. He'd scribble observations on bark, sketch flower petals with pollen timings, but rarely include measurements or method. One scholar noted in frustration, "His documentation is like listening to a song hummed through a door, beautiful but useless." And yet, one document survived. Not an instructional manual, but something stranger. Tucked behind the stone base of Hive 14, in a hollow sealed with beeswax, was a scroll. Thin bark, tightly rolled, water-stained around the edges. It bore no title. Just a single line written near the top. "What bees know they do not teach, but they leave traces if you know where to look." The scroll contained what can only be described as a kind of seasonal meditation. Part observation, part prayer, part inventory. It recorded the flavor of wax based on wind direction, the mood of bees on rainy mornings, the sound of the mountain air after the third frost. It spoke quietly of rhythm, of how the smoke wasn't just to calm the bees, but to signal something. That each hive responded not only to temperature or pollen, but to the timing of the smoke itself. The scholar who found the scroll published a paper. It made little impact, too vague, too poetic, not reproducible. He filed it away, and the empire moved on. But for a small group of fringe apiarists, those who still kept bees with hand-carved tools and watched flowers before calendars, Yusuf's scroll became something else, not scripture, not science, just a reminder that knowledge sometimes dies with a person, that preservation is not just about record-keeping, but about passing on the unteachable through story, repetition, habit, and time. Let me tell you something curious about wax. Pure beeswax never spoils. It can survive centuries without losing its essential quality. Archaeologists have found Roman wax tablets still pliable, still fragrant. It holds its form through fire and famine, war and winter. But it's only useful if you know how to light it. That's what Yusuf understood. He wasn't just shaping wax, he was shaping memory, sealing moments into golden vessels, trusting they might outlast him. After his death, a handful of candle makers in Izmir began asking for Erciyes wax, even though no one could produce it anymore. It became a kind of shorthand, less for a product, more for a lost ideal, a benchmark, a sigh. Over time, his hives collapsed into the soil. The bark scrolls decayed. But stories, small ones, survived. Like how Yusuf could tell the health of a colony just by the color of the wax rim, or how he once refused to sell a harvest because the bees hadn't sung properly that spring. Silly maybe, but who else was listening? Eventually the land was sold. A vineyard grew over part of the slope. The rest became pasture. By the early 1800s, the apiary was gone, and yet, on certain spring mornings when the mountain fog rolls, in just right, older shepherds say you can still hear the hum, faint, like smoke, and sometimes among the wildflowers you'll spot a bee, not rushing, not swarming, but moving slowly, like it remembers something. And isn't that all any of us can hope for? To leave behind a trace, a ripple in the wax? There's one last fragment worth sharing, found scrawled on the back of a wax-stained bark sheet, possibly Yusuf's last written line. "Let them say I kept silence, but I kept it well." Tonight, somewhere in the archives, that scroll sits unread. The hives have returned to moss. The mountain breathes, slow and steady, but the light, that faint glow from a long-dead candle, still flickers. And now, maybe you carry a little of it too. Now, let your thoughts drift to another mountain, another forgotten story, waiting patiently in the quiet. Story 7. The Census Clerk of Edirne. Let me take you to Edirne, sometime in the late 17th century. The streets are quiet in the early morning, cobbled and damp from last night's drizzle. The call to prayer has just ended, and smoke from hearths curls gently into the soft blue of dawn. You're walking past a stone building with low, shuttered windows. Inside, behind those walls thick with the scent of parchment and ink, sits a man named Halil. He isn't a statesman, a warrior, or even a merchant. No one has written a poem about him. His name does not appear in history books, not in bold anyway. But if you lived in Edirne in those years, Halil was the man who knew more about you than anyone else. Halil was a census clerk, a Deftedar's assistant, officially. But unlike the high-ranking scribes who came and went with flair and fury, Halil stayed at his desk, day after day, decade after decade, quietly recording names, households, occupations, and livestock counts into a series of heavy, leather-bound ledgers called the Tahrir Defterleri. His desk sat beneath a high, arched window that caught the sun just after midday. Dust floated in the air like slow-moving snow, and Halil, wrapped in a plain woolen robe, would sit there with his reed pen, whispering numbers to himself under his breath. Tap, tap, scratch, tap, tap, scratch. The pages smelled of earth and oil, aged, parchment-bound in calfskin, laced at the corners with worn thread. Every morning he'd light a tiny oil lamp, warm his fingers, and begin. You might think a census is dull, just lists and numbers. But to Halil, it was a kind of listening. He believed that names carried echoes. That a ledger was more than a record. It was a mirror of the living world. One column could reflect a birth, another the death of a matriarch whose name once fed 3 generations. One missing entry could mean a caravan lost to a river crossing. A new household might point to a wedding, a child, or a chance escape from famine. The Ottoman Empire relied on men like Halil. How else could a sultan tax villages from thousands of kilometers away? How else could soldiers be assigned, fields allocated, or wells maintained? But Halil didn't think about strategy. He thought about the butcher's son who always brought him dried figs, or the widow who signed with an X because she'd never learned to write. He thought about the shepherd who claimed to own 5 goats one year and 9 the next, and yet Halil had seen him at the mosque in the same ragged tunic, looking hungrier than ever. "Do numbers lie?" Halil once asked his apprentice, a quiet boy named Osman. Osman shrugged. "They just wait to be believed." It was in the spring of 1692, during a particularly dusty season, that a curious anomaly appeared. It was simple enough, a village name, repeated twice in one ledger. Gulyaze. Place of roses, the name meant. Halil had passed through it once, long ago. A scattering of houses on a windswept plain, nothing remarkable. But there it was again, same name, different region, identical list of family names and crop tallies. Every number duplicated. Had someone copied the entry by mistake? He checked the handwriting, not his, not Osman's. The ink was darker, newer, a different hand entirely. So Halil traced it back, page by page, ledger by ledger, year by year. And what he uncovered wasn't fraud exactly, nor was it innocent error. It was something stranger, a ghost village. Someone, likely a former clerk, had invented an entire duplicate settlement. Identical names, identical tax yields. For over 5 years the empire had been taxing a village that did not exist. It wasn't the first time, nor would it be the last. But to Halil it felt like betrayal, because the census was supposed to be honest. It was the closest thing to truth in a shifting empire. Borders moved, sultans rose and fell. But the names in his ledgers? They were real. He debated reporting it. But to whom? To his superior, the man who hadn't stepped foot in the record room in 3 months, to the traveling inspector, the one who always left with a pouch of coin and a sheep. Halil did something different. He annotated the entry in red ink, a color rarely used, with a note in the margins. Double entry, question origin, no proof of location. It was a quiet rebellion. But it was all he could do. Osman asked him why he didn't just remove it. Halil answered with a phrase that stayed with Osman for the rest of his life. Even ghosts pay taxes in empires like this. The next morning, Halil returned to his desk and continued as usual, because there were still births to record, marriages to mark, bread to count, bees to log. Even in an empire of smoke and mirrors, someone had to keep the candle lit. You see, history often celebrates kings and conquerors. But it is men like Halil who tell us what truly mattered, who lived where, who ate what, and how many oxen pulled the plough. Not glamorous, not thrilling, but essential, the odd part. Years later, when those ledgers were moved to the Topkapi archives, a scholar noticed the same thing Halil had, the ghost village and the red ink. It sparked a debate in academic circles. Was it fraud, a clerical error, or a covert protest? No one could say for sure, but the name Halil was noted in the archivist's margin. A small name, a silent witness, a man who whispered history onto paper while the rest of the world marched loudly by. And as the dust settled over Edirne's ledgers, one question remained unanswered. If the empire once taxed a village that never existed, how many more are still hidden in the folds of history? The morning after Halil annotated the ghost village entry, something unusual happened. A letter arrived, not a royal decree, not a formal dispatch from Istanbul. Just a single page, creased and smelling faintly of cedar, tucked into an envelope, sealed with no official stamp, only a circle of dried wax cracked at one edge, delivered by a courier who did not wait for a reply. It was addressed to Halil personally, in elegant but unremarkable Ottoman script. He opened it slowly, as if the act itself might reshape the day. Inside was a message, brief, carefully worded, unsigned. We see what you've marked. Continue the work. The rest will follow. No insignia, no threat. Just that. Halil sat with it for a while, rubbing the wax between his fingers, letting the weight of the paper rest on his palm. He didn't show Osman. He didn't speak of it again. But that night, he placed the letter between the pages of his personal journal, next to a sketch he'd once made of Gulyaza. Real or not, he had drawn it from memory. You might be wondering who sent the note. A superior, a rival clerk, an inquisitive scholar keeping tabs. Truth is, we don't know. All we have is the note, preserved in the same journal Osman would inherit years later, now stored in a quiet archive room in Bursa, its corners yellowed, but its ink still legible. And Halil? He returned to the ledgers. The routine of the census room resumed, tallying firewood, noting disputes over barley fields, recording a drop in bee colonies near the river. More interesting than it sounds, if you imagine a world where each number tells a small human story, who burned more logs during the cold months, who might have lost a child to illness, who gained a daughter-in-law and needed a second oven in the courtyard. By mid-year, Halil had noticed a pattern. Gulyaza, the ghost village, was not alone. 2 more villages appeared with eerily identical names, crops, and head counts, only minor differences, an extra chicken here, a missing mule there, but the structure of the entries was suspiciously alike, like a template reused and barely altered. He began quietly marking each in the margins, not in red ink this time. That would have drawn attention. Instead, he developed a code, 4 tiny dots arranged in a square just below the village name. almost invisible to the casual reader, but he and Osman understood. Ghosts, that's what they started calling them. "I marked another ghost," Osman would whisper, handing over a new ledger. Halil nodded and the work continued. Outside, Edirne moved with the rhythm of the seasons. Carpets were aired out in the spring breeze. Scribes argued about decimal points over coffee. Farmers lined up at tax offices, clutching statements written by someone they'd never met, declaring yields they could barely remember harvesting. And still, the ghosts came. 5. Then 7. Then 12. All across the Empire's vast territory, Anatolia, Rumelia, the Black Sea coast, villages emerged in ink, existed only on parchment, then disappeared in the next census. Some were likely real places that had been abandoned. Plague. War, a failed harvest, and never removed from the rolls. Others, fabrications. The reasons varied. A greedy clerk, a governor inflating his numbers for prestige, a tax collector claiming more so he could skim from the top. The system, like the empire itself, was too large to fully monitor. But Halil wasn't trying to reform the empire. He was trying to remember who was real. He once told Osman something strange during a quiet afternoon as they traced a particularly elaborate fraud in the Karaman region. "You know what scares me most?" he asked, dipping his pen. "That someday someone might look at our ledgers and think we are the ghosts." It was meant as a joke, but Osman didn't laugh because the fear had begun to settle in, the weight of recording a world that might never have existed or might soon be erased entirely. That summer, Halil made a decision. He began keeping a second set of records, handwritten, personal, stored separately from the imperial ledgers. A diary of names and notes that didn't make it into the official counts, stories people told him while waiting in line, births that happened before the midwife arrived, families that had moved into abandoned houses and didn't yet exist. On paper, he called it his Defter of the Forgotten. Osman helped him compile it, at first cautiously, then with growing commitment. Together they cross-referenced and mapped families no one else bothered to record. They included disputes that had been resolved informally, outside the court over a shared pot of soup. They noted illnesses, rumors of wolves in the hills, strange wind patterns that caused the wells to dry early. It wasn't rebellious exactly, but it was careful. If the empire was a great machine, their Defter was a soft breath against the gears. A quiet reminder that humans lived in between the numbers. Years passed, and then one day Halil disappeared. He left no note, no warning, just an empty desk, a still-burning oil lamp, and an untouched breakfast of lentil soup and stale bread. Osman searched the building, the surrounding streets, even visited a cousin of Halil's in a neighboring district. Nothing. Some said he'd been summoned to Istanbul. Others whispered about arrest or worse, but no records survive. Only Osman's journal, where he wrote, "The desk feels larger now. The dust does not settle as quickly. I think of the ghosts and wonder if Halil has become one too." Osman took up Halil's post. He never received another mysterious letter, but he continued the work just as his teacher had done, recording the real, marking the doubtful, and keeping his own private Defter, which would later be found and studied and puzzled over by historians trying to trace the mind of a clerk in a forgotten census room. And the question still lingers like the scent of old ink on parchment. How many names in our histories once belonged to real voices? And how many were simply convenient echoes? By the time Osman was promoted to chief scribe of Edirne's census division, the empire had entered what many would later call its slow unraveling. But at the time, it didn't feel like a collapse. It felt like more paperwork, more demands from Istanbul, more revisions of tax codes, more shifting boundaries of provincial oversight that meant entire ledgers had to be recopied, sometimes just to reflect the change of a governor's seal. Osman did his best to stay invisible within the system. That was the only way to survive it. Never do less than what was asked, but never more than what would draw eyes. He kept the routine, tallied the fields, counted the men, reconciled births with deaths, and quietly, almost ritualistically, he continued maintaining the defter of the forgotten. It had grown fat, not in volume but in texture, its pages warped with the ink of 1,000 untold lives. Women who never appeared in legal records, midwives who served 10 villages yet left no trace, nomads who drifted into valleys for a single season and vanished, children who died before their first census, fields ploughed by hands no tax collector had bothered to see. One night Osman copied a name into the final page. It was a boy, Yusuf, age 8. The family was not registered anywhere in the official census. They had fled a famine near Erzurum and wandered for weeks before settling in a collapsed roadside shelter east of Edirne. Yusuf had come with his father to the census office not to register, but simply to ask where he could get work. His father said nothing, just stood beside the boy, fingers twitching, face unreadable. Osman offered them bread. That was all he could do. He never saw them again. And so he wrote Yusuf's name, not in the official registry but in the defter. No birth date, no title, just a line that read, Yusuf, small hands, asked where to find work, spoke like he had. Read the ledgers. That was the last entry before the defter disappeared. It wasn't stolen, there was no break-in, no fire, no whisper of an inquiry. It was simply gone. Osman discovered its absence one late afternoon during a record audit. The shelf where it had always lived was empty. The space smelled faintly of lavender soap, the kind Halil used to favor, but Osman had not used that scent in years. He checked his drawers, the back cupboard, even the bottom of the coal box. Nothing. You might think he panicked. Or filed a report, or searched the homes of his colleagues, but no. Osman sat down, folded his hands, and stared at the empty shelf. Then he began to write. Not a replacement, not a copy, a letter. To whomever has taken the defter, he wrote, I hope you read it carefully. I hope you see that the world is not merely made of names and taxes and years, but of pauses, of glances not recorded, of silences no scribe could catch. He placed the letter on the shelf where the defter had been, tucked beneath a dull green ledger titled Rumelia Wheat Yield, 1683. He never expected a reply, and he never got one. Years passed. Osman aged. The census office thinned. Younger scribes came and went, less interested in subtle ink marks or double-checking the head count of semi-nomadic goat herders. The empire rolled forward, slow and tired. One day, a visiting scholar from the capital arrived in Edirne. She was studying patterns of false enumeration, trying to trace corruption through mismatched ledgers. Osman offered her tea and a quiet corner in which to work. She accepted both. On her last day, she asked him a question. Have you ever heard of a place called Gulyaze? Osman looked up, startled. The name hadn't been spoken aloud in decades, she continued. It appears only once in a census dated 1649, but it doesn't show up before or after. The crops listed were improbable for the region. I thought it might be a clerical error, but she trailed off, watching him. Osman smiled faintly. What made you look for it? She shrugged. A strange notation. 4 tiny ink dots, arranged like a square. I thought it was a pagination mark, but no. Other page had them. He didn't respond, not with words. Instead, he rose, fetched the green ledger from the shelf, Rumelia Wheat Yield 1683, and opened it. There, just below the listing for the Edirne region, someone had folded a sheet of thick parchment. It wasn't bound. It bore no seal. Just a series of handwritten lines. each entry beginning with a name. It wasn't the defter, but it was a list. Osman didn't ask how it had gotten there. He didn't even recognize the handwriting, but the names were familiar. He closed the ledger, handed it to the scholar and said, "Keep it. Someone wanted you to find it." As she left, Osman felt the silence settle again. Not heavy, not haunted, just quieter than before. When he died, some years later, the census room was cleared out and repurposed into a storage area for disused ink bottles and broken chairs. His personal belongings were minimal: a worn rug, a dented inkwell, a scrap of paper tucked into a coat pocket that read, "What is remembered lives, what is recorded, lingers." The defter itself has never been recovered, but fragments, pages, single lines, even just marginal notes, have surfaced in obscure libraries, sewn into the bindings of unrelated ledgers, even etched onto the wood of drawer bottoms, as if someone somewhere took Halil's idea seriously, that every person deserves to be remembered, even if only by one ink-stained clerk in a dusty room, no longer visited. So next time you read a name in an old census, think of Halil, think of Osman, think of the ghosts they gently refused to forget, and ask yourself how many stories sit quietly between the lines, waiting to be heard.